Hello everyone and welcome to Voice After 50, the podcast where we as women over 50 and beyond talk about, unravel and explore the complexities, the changes and the exciting explorations we experience at this stage of our lives. I'm Beverley and I'm so glad you're here. Before we start, I just want to remind you to subscribe to my podcast so you can get updates and alerts when new episodes drop. Okay, so let's get into this. I want to start with a question, and you don't need to answer it out loud, but just notice what comes up for you. What does overthinking actually mean to you? In other words, if someone said, "Oh, I'm an overthinker," what would you quietly assume about them? Because I think it's one of those words we use and throw about in conversations quite a lot, almost in passing, as if everyone knows exactly what we mean. But when you slow down and think about it, it's not actually that clear. As you probably know by now, a lot of what I talk about on this podcast comes from my own reflections. Something might happen, a conversation, something I've seen on television, something online, and it just stays with me. It gets me thinking being the operative word. And sometimes that thinking is genuinely useful, insightful even. It helps me understand myself or a situation a little better. And sometimes it quietly crosses a line. So when I talk about overthinking, I want to be really clear about what I mean and what I don't mean. I know overthinking is often talked about alongside anxiety, depression, and mental health struggles. I've read a fair bit about it to understand that, but that's not the space this episode is coming from. Partly because I'm not qualified to speak from that angle. I'm not a psychologist, a counsellor, a life coach, or any expert of that type. Also because that's not the conversation I'm having here today. So when I say overthinking, I'm talking about the kind of thinking where you second guess yourself a bit. You know, where you replay moments, where you wonder if you should have handled something differently, where you're spiralling, you're just being quite hard on yourself. To me, overthinking is when a thought that could have passed through your mind quietly decides to settle in. It's when reflection turns into replay, when curiosity turns into criticism, and when one moment turns into 5 or 10 slightly different versions of the same story. And if you're someone who doesn't have many what I would call sounding board friends, people who can look at things clearly and say, actually, that sounds fine to me, then it becomes very easy to get stuck inside your own head. Because when you're your only sounding board, your thoughts don't always get challenged. They don't get softened and accommodated. They don't get put back into proportion. And that's usually when the noise starts to build. Do you ever feel like your mind is a crowded room, especially now that you're over 50? There's one voice saying, go on, do it. Another voice saying, maybe slow down. And a few more chiming in with what ifs and should haves. And before you know it, you're tired. Not because you've done too much, but because you've thought too much. That constant inner debate can be exhausting and at times completely paralysing. And I want to stress, this episode isn't about ignoring those thoughts. It's not about switching them off or pretending that they don't exist. It's about trying to figure out how to quiet the noise and internal clamour, how to stop every thought from demanding your attention so you can move forward with a bit more confidence and a bit more peace. So let's see if we can figure this out together. Imagine waking up one morning and noticing that your mind feels quieter. Not empty, not blank, just quieter. You're not immediately replaying yesterday. You're not already worrying about tomorrow. You're just here in your own life. I think it's quite easy to assume that as we get older, indecision and self-doubt are just part of the deal. That with experience comes caution, and with caution comes hesitation. But I don't actually think that's what's happening. What I think is happening is that you've lived enough life to know that choices matter. You've seen how words land. You've watched how decisions ripple outward. You've learned that things aren't always as simple as they once seemed. So your mind tries to protect you by thinking things through, sometimes very thoroughly, sometimes repeatedly. That's when your inner committee shows up. You know the one. The part of you that wants to speak up, the part that wants to keep the peace, the part that remembers past mistakes, and the part that worries about how you'll be perceived. They all start talking, all at once. And suddenly, doing nothing feels safer than choosing. And nowhere is this more familiar than in the moments you replay later. You're in a conversation. Someone says something that doesn't quite sit right. You feel it straight away, maybe a tightening in your chest or a little knot in your stomach. But you don't say anything. You smile, you nod, you change the subject, you move on. And then later, your mind lights up. You're driving home or standing in the shower or laying awake at 3 a.m. in the morning. And suddenly, you know exactly what you should have said. I did this last week, actually. A friend made a comment about my work, nothing cruel, just a bit dismissive, and I smiled, changed the subject, kept it light. But for the next 2 days, I rewrote that conversation about 15 times, each version a little sharper, a little clearer, a little braver than the last. And none of it changed what actually happened. In one version, you're calm and measured. In another, you're confident, clear and articulate. In another, you finally say the thing you wish you had said years ago. At first, these thoughts almost feel helpful, like you're getting clarity. But then something shifts. Now you're questioning yourself. You're critiquing yourself, having a quiet word with yourself. Why didn't you speak up? Why do you always freeze? Why on earth did you say that? You should know better by now. And the more you replay it, the smaller you start to feel. Here's what I've been learning, or at least what I'm starting to notice in myself. That replay, I don't think it's actually giving me clarity. It feels more like rumination. My mind sort of churning over the same moment, trying to find resolution where there might not be any. It's almost like my mind is trying to regain control after the moment has already passed. And instead of helping you move forward, it keeps you emotionally stuck right there. You can't win an argument that's already happened. And every time you relive it, you're quietly teaching yourself that it's not safe to let things go. So, what should we do instead? Well, we can start by changing how we relate to those thoughts. The next time you notice yourself replaying a conversation, try this and do it gently. Just say to yourself, I'm replaying. That's it. Not, I'm being ridiculous. Not, why am I like this? Just, I'm replaying. That simple naming stops you in the moment and creates a little bit of space. And space is where choice lives. Then instead of asking why you didn't say something, try asking a kinder question. What was I protecting in that moment? Maybe you were protecting peace. Maybe you were protecting yourself. Maybe you needed time to process. That doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. And this is where it really matters. Silence in one moment does not mean silence forever. You're allowed to circle back. You're allowed to clarify. You're allowed to say, I've been thinking about something. Confidence after 50 doesn't come from having the perfect response in real time. It comes from trusting that you can respond when you're ready. There's a difference between reflecting and ruminating. For me, reflection tends to feel calmer. It usually leads somewhere, like I've actually learned something. But rumination, that feels a bit tight in my chest. It loops back on itself. And if I'm honest, it almost feels like it's saying, let me punish you for this. When you notice that tightness, that's your cue to come back to the present. Feel your feet on the floor. take one slow breath. Maybe place a hand on your heart. Close your eyes if it's safe to. And remind yourself, I'm here. I'm safe. I can choose again. I'm learning that confidence at this stage of life can be quieter than I was taught to expect. It doesn't need to rush in with the perfect answer. It doesn't need to prove anything. Maybe it doesn't even rehearse those imaginary conversations anymore. Maybe it just trusts. It trusts that you've survived hard things. It trusts that you can handle discomfort. It trusts that what you think is valid, even when you need time to articulate it. The goal isn't to silence your inner world. It's to lead it with kindness. Because when your inner world feels safer, your outer voice becomes stronger. If this episode resonated with you, maybe carry it with you the next time your mind wants to replay an old moment. You don't need to keep reliving the past to prepare for the future. Your voice after 50 isn't fading, it's becoming more honest, more grounded, more yours. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, talk soon. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and follow the podcast so you never miss an update. Also, follow and join me on Instagram at VoiceAfter50 and Facebook, where we can continue these conversations, share reflections, and support each other through all the twists and turns life after 50 brings. A quick note. The content of this and all podcast episodes is for general information and entertainment purposes only. It's not professional advice, counselling or therapy. Please consult a qualified professional for any personal, medical or psychological concerns.